This video is a part of our Mill-Turn GMD customization series. In this specific video, we're going to take a look at chucks and jaws. First, we'll take a quick review of what a GMD file is. We'll review how to access the GMD file, where you can find it, and how to open up and start editing it. We'll review how to add and modify the chuck jaws. And then we're going to review how to implement that customization into your process. First, let's look at what a GMD file is. A GMD file is a component library that stores tool locators, chucks, and jaws for a particular machine. Each .machine file has both inch and metric GMD files. They contain the same information, just appropriately scaled for either inch or metric programming. The GMD file is unique to a particular machine with a specific turret size, or in the case of a B-axis head, the specific mounting position of the tool. For this reason, we can't take a GMD file for one machine and use it for another, although we are able to use certain components out of a GMD file and copying them into a different one. Starting in Mastercam 2020, the chucks and jaws are now stored in the GMD file. This provides the end user the ability to edit the chucks and jaws and to add different sizes that can be swapped out for each new job. First, let's take a look at the chucks and jaws when we start a new file and we select our machine. Now, I've already gone through the setup process with this file, so we're going to go back into the job setup and take a look at our chucks and jaws. In here we can see that we have a list of the chucks and jaws for both the left and right spindles. Now you'll see this in Mastercam 2020 and newer. What we can do is we can right click on these and we have the option to either edit the chuck, so we can open it up and we can modify the specific values to suit the chuck that we're using on our particular job. We can also modify the number of jaws. In Mastercam 2021, we also have the option to select it as a solid entity as opposed to defining it parametrically. The final step here is we can assign a particular spindle speed, which is often crucial for certain setups on a machine. We can do the same thing for the jaws. We can edit. And then the jaws, you can see that we have all kinds of options in here to modify the thickness of the jaws. We can modify the outer radius, and then down here we can add or remove steps with specific dimensions and apply a radius to each step as well. So we can really size our jaws to match what we're actually using at the machine. The same is true in Mastercam 2021. We can also define the jaws as a solid entity or a chain. Once we're done with that, we can come over to the parameters and we can define it as an OD or ID jaw, and then we can set the reference position to somewhere on our profile. This gives us the option to go out to the actual geometry and highlight different points along that profile. This point will become the new 0 point of the jaws. When we go to pick off, this point will be used for reference. We'll set it back to the front face. And we're done. The other option that we have is we can create a library of chucks and jaws, and that's the main purpose of this video, is to show you how you can add a library of chucks and jaws so that you don't have to go through and modify these every time you start a new job. If we right click, we can say select new chuck, and what we get here is a list of the current chucks that are defined in this current GMD file. You can see we have a 10-inch and a 6-inch chuck already defined within this. Now, one of these is probably being used for the left and one for the right. You can see they're different sizes. The difference between the upper section and the lower is that these are all the components in our GMD, and the ones on the bottom are our defaults. Those are what come up every time we select our machine, and we have the ability to swap these out. Next, let's look at how we can add some chucks and jaws to our own GMD file. The easiest way to access the GMD is to have a machine selected in Mastercam. You'll also notice if you jump over to the Code Expert window that your machine should be visible here in the Machine Explorer tab. If for some reason you don't see this tab, just go to your view and make sure the Machine Explorer is toggled on. What we can see here is that starting in Mastercam 2020, we are now able to modify the GMD file directly. Now, prior to this, if you were an end user, you would not have had access to the GMD files directly, but now you do. So, we can double-click on these, which would then launch another session of Mastercam and allow us to modify the GMD file directly. However, it's good practice to always modify a backup and then to bring that in, just in case we make any mistakes. So, the easiest way is to right-click on here and say Open Containing Folder. This is going to take us directly to where the GMD files are stored. We can see we have the inch and the metric. If we back up once, we'll see that this is in the directory with my .machine file. Every time I reference the .machine file, it's going to unpack a folder that contains all of the elements. And these are what are being used during my Mastercam session. In this case, I'm just going to select the inch GMD file to modify. So I'm going to copy this to my desktop. So there I have it. Now I want to go back into Mastercam and I'm going to open it from there to make my modifications. We need to start a fresh session of Mastercam, so we'll do File, New, and I'm not going to save what I'm working on. First we want to go to the Machine tab and then the Machine Definition. The very last icon is our Mill-Turn Component Library Manager. So we can select that. It'll open up in a blank session. From here, we can hit Open, go to our desktop, and select the GMD that we copied. Now you may also want to copy and rename this version and keep another backup of your original, again, just in case you make any mistakes. Once we open this up, we can see that what we have is our turret with our tool locators. Those we'll talk about in another video. Then we have our chuck group and our jaw group containing the elements that we saw earlier on. Now we want to go about adding a new chuck to this list. So what we can do is just take note of the naming convention. We want to replicate this just to keep everything nice and organized. So let's say that I'm going to add a 12-inch chuck to the list. So now I'm going to basically right-click on the group and say Add Chuck. I want to give it that name, so 12-inch. Now, I am defining this as a left or right chuck, although chucks can be used for either spindle. So if this chuck is defined and it can actually be placed on either the left or the right spindle, I don't have to name it based on the spindle. I can define it once and use it on either spindle. So in this case, I could actually just put both. Then I'm going to go through and just modify the aspects of this that define it as my 12-inch chuck. For this example, we're just going to change the outside diameter and leave the rest set the way it is. Again, you can also change the number of jaws. Maybe this one has 4. Then we can go to our parameters and we can give it the right spindle speed. Since it's a larger chuck, we'll bring this down to 2000 RPM. Now you can see we have our new 12-inch chuck defined. Additionally, if we have some extra jaws, we can do the same thing for the jaw group. We can right-click, say Add Chuck Jaws, and we'll want to give it a name. We'll just call it 12-inch chuck jaw. Next, we can go through and just customize any aspects. Again, these are all things that you can go through and review. The outer edge is just the outside radius. If it's a 12-inch chuck, maybe the outer diameter of the jaws matches that at 12 inches. And additionally, we can put a radius on different aspects of this. Now this window is also able to be dynamically rotated if we want to view our chucks or jaws from a different angle. In this case, we'll just change the bottom radius. Maybe it grips onto a 4-inch radius, and there we can see that puts the radius on the jaws. Now we can jump over to the parameters. Again, just making sure that our correct location is selected here for our reference point. This is where the jaws will be picked. And everything's set there. The next thing I can do is I can use this new chuck I've defined and set that as my default. Down here at the bottom you can see we're using the 10-inch chuck by default on the left spindle. So let's replace that in this example. We'll right click and say delete component, and then we'll do the same thing with the chuck. Now all we need to do is we need to grab the chuck first and drag it down onto this placeholder. Next we'll drag the jaws onto that, so I'll grab my 12-inch chuck jaws and place them there. Now I'm basically done. I've added everything that I want and I'm ready to just save my GMD file, so I can hit save. The last step is creating a metric version. If we know that we're going to program in metric as well, and we also want these changes to be available when we program in metric, then we can create the corresponding metric GMD. If you never plan to program in the opposite system, you don't need to do the following step. But just in case you do, all we have to do is come up to the very top, right click, and say convert to metric. This is just warning us that it's going to convert from inches to metric. Now what we need to do is remember to do a save as. If we do a save, we've now converted it to metric and saved over our inch version. So we want to do save as. It's going right to our desktop where we were. Now we just want to rename this to match the name of our metric GMD, and it happens to be MM on the end. So now we have both GMDs created. The last step is we want to add those back into our machine environment. So we can close out of this window, and we still have our Code Expert window pulled up. So this is still referencing the same .machine file that's located in the previous location that we viewed it in. So I'm going to minimize this for a second. We'll go to our desktop, and then we'll pull up that same window that we had before. If you recall, we pulled the GMD files out of the subfolder for this machine. So we can simply open that back up, take our libraries, copy, and replace them. Now if we go back to Code Expert, we see there's an asterisk symbol which is telling us that Mastercam determined that there was a change to those files. Now if we want to permanently save that back into the .machine, we need to say save. Once the asterisk is gone, that means those changes have been saved, and now when I call up this machine, I should see those options available. Now we'll go back to Mastercam. Again, we'll just start a fresh session. I'm going to open up a blank part from my desktop, and then we'll select our machine. Once it opens up, we see now we have our 12-inch chuck body is selected as the default option. Along with that, it brought in our designated spindle speed. If we ever want to swap out the jaws in the middle of the process, all we need to do is just remove the jaws. We can right click and say select new chuck. Now we're back to our list. We can now switch back to the 10-inch chuck, and then right click and say add jaws. And now we can grab our original jaws that we had for the left spindle, and those will come in too. Those again bringing in the designated spindle speed that was set for that chuck. The last thing to mention is that if you're opening up old part files that have already been saved before the modifications, you won't see the new chuck jaw options until you reload the machine environment. So you will need to hit reload, and after it's done rereading the .machine file, when you go back to your job setup, you should be able to right click, select new, and then see your new options. A final comment is, if you're going to be modifying your own chucks and jaws or tool locators, be sure to make a backup of your .machine file. It may also be a good idea to pass this along to your Mastercam reseller so they also have a copy of the latest environment you're using. If you request changes in the future, and they don't know that you've modified your environment, it's possible that they'll send you back a different version, and then you may not see some of the options that you'd customized. So it's always good to pass this along to your Mastercam reseller so they have the latest environment that you're using as well.